Thanks everyone. My start. So absolutely delighted to welcome Thomas King from Food Frontier. Thomas King is a founder, international speaker, and future food specialist who's been recognised as one of Australia's most accomplished young pioneers. For over a decade, Thomas has driven food systems, environmental, and poverty alleviation initiatives across 5 continents. He was named Young Australian of the Year for Victoria in 2015, was awarded a Maya Innovation Fellowship in 2019, and was on the Australians 2022 100 Top Innovators list. If you've got any questions throughout, please throw them into swap card for the live discussion. I'll hand over to Thomas.
Thanks, Lucas. Hi, everyone.
Firstly, I'm going to apologise for my very non-conference-y attire. I'm going to a picnic after this, so I've just dropped in and heading out shortly after. Before I start, I just wanted to sort of get a show of hands. There's a couple of familiar faces in the room, so I know there's some folks that understand this space quite well. But if I was to sort of throw 3 categories at you, hands up who is already involved in some way in alternative proteins beyond just perhaps consuming products. Who's volunteering, who's working, who's part of a club, who's been to events before? Hands up. Okay, cool. Who's sort of like following the space, you're interested and engaged, but are wanting to understand how you might get involved? Cool. Who's like, I have no idea what alternative proteins are? Perfect. Awesome. Okay, great. So, mixed room. My name's Thomas. The organisation that I run is called Food Frontier. So my plan is to sort of just do a quick recap of why alternative proteins, tell you a bit about Food Frontier's work and theory of change, some of the kind of key developments in alternative proteins across the different fields, and then end with sort of how I think you might get involved if that's something you're interested in. So firstly, I imagine most people here, if you've come to this session, probably understand the why, but there are a whole number of reasons why we need to transform our protein supply and reduce our reliance on systems of industrial animal agriculture and fishing, which ranged from public health, from chronic disease to antimicrobial resistance, zoonotic disease and pandemic risk, through to climate change, biodiversity loss and food insecurity. And of course, you might also be here because the animal welfare, animal suffering component is undoubtedly a big part of this. We're talking about at least 70 billion land animals used in intensive food production systems. The numbers are in the trillions when we're talking about sea life. Just a quick data point that's one of the more recent ones that I found particularly compelling if we just hone in on the climate change piece. Boston Consulting Group produced a report last year that looked at the impact of different types of investment across different climate interventions, and they found dollar for dollar investing in improving and scaling meat alternatives drives 3 times more reductions in greenhouse gas emissions than cement tech, 7 times more than buildings, and 11 times more than zero emission cars. So from an impact standpoint and also a neglectedness standpoint, alternative proteins is why, that's exactly why I'm focused on this field as someone who's been in the non-profit space for 12, 13 years now. It is just one of the highest impact areas I see to address some of the most pressing challenges we face. How Food Frontier is going about that, I'll describe shortly. Top line, our vision is a diverse and sustainable protein supply that supports people and our planet to flourish. And how we go about that is by advancing dialogue and decision making to accelerate alternative protein markets for those reasons that I mentioned. We are Australia and New Zealand's think tank on alternative proteins, so our work, which I'll describe in a sec, falls into a couple of areas. Just quickly, our program logic, and if you're not familiar with program logic, it's a simple way to describe how an organisation's activities generate the outcomes and impact that it is intending to create in the world. And so inputs, throughputs, outputs, outcomes, impact. Inputs obviously are our financial resources and human resources. Our financial resources coming predominantly from philanthropy, and then we have a few revenue streams like our conference and sometimes government commissioning research. We then invest those as well as we can to generate outputs like publications, media interviews, meetings with businesses and policymakers and other influential stakeholders, guides, submissions to government, etc. that we hope and intend will have positive outcomes for the industry that we are trying to advance, whether that's an uptick in product numbers, quality, accessibility, level of investment, regulatory settings, dialogue, attitudes, etc. Ultimately, the market outcomes we want to see from that are a growth in market share of alternatives to conventional animal agriculture, so a growing proportion of centre of plate protein being alternative over conventional protein. And then also we look at export as well and the role that Australia and New Zealand play in the Asia Pacific. And if our data and our theory of change is watertight, that should be having those positive impacts in the world across environment, health and ethical. Obviously, impact measurement is always challenging, particularly for a strategic systems change organisation that is operating in a very complex market, but we do the best we can to measure as many of these things as possible. This is just a visual sort of representation of that similar theory of change. So we have public sector engagement, our research and thought leadership and our industry support that generates outcomes around innovation, development, growth, awareness, supply and demand that has those ultimate impacts across environment, health and economic. I think I've already covered this. So our main work is around research, events and direct engagements with businesses, policymakers, regulators and so on. And here's sort of a quick snapshot of since kind of 2018 when we sort of started our first projects, some of the outputs that we've created. And all of our research, our reports are freely accessible on our website. So if you're interested in any of these particular pieces, you can access them there. Just to finish, as I said, our theory of change considers Australia and New Zealand in an Asia-Pacific context. The Asia-Pacific is home to more than 60% of the world's population, has a very steep meat consumption trajectory with rising middle class, affluence and an aspiration to eat more meat and a lot of Western influence in terms of dietary change. And so Australia and New Zealand already are net exporters of the food that we produce, including, a lot of traditional protein. We're the second to third largest beef exporter every year. We compete with the US after Brazil for that second place. We also have really strong R&D capabilities in the exact fields of science needed to advance alternative proteins. And so our vision really is for Australia and New Zealand not only to become, to be able to lead in terms of alternative proteins domestically, but also to export IP ingredients or finished products to other regions and hopefully have ripples beyond our own borders. Because obviously our domestic population is only a very small fraction globally, and the number of animals farmed in our systems is also a small fraction compared to global numbers. And so we think about the potential for Australia and New Zealand to have an outsized impact beyond our own borders, like other regions have in this space, such as Singapore, California, Israel, and so on. So what do we talk about? What do we mean when we're talking about alternative proteins? We think predominantly about these three categories, although the lines are starting to get a lot more blurred, and I could probably set out at least 6 on this slide. Plant-based alternatives, which I'll unpack in a second, cell-cultivated meat, and products of fermentation, whether that be precision or biomass. There are also fields like molecular farming, which I won't touch on today, and blended, I think, is a really interesting conversation which sort of sits between some of these categories, blended and hybrid products, where you've got either conventional animal meat blended with plant protein, or in the case of cell-cultivated meat, the first products to hit market will contain quite a significant portion of plant protein, just in terms of the scale of production in those early days. So plant-based alternatives you'll be familiar with. There's obviously traditional kind of meat alternatives, and not even meat alternatives, just plant protein that has existed for millennia in certain regions of the world. There's whole food sort of mimics like jackfruit and certain mushroom products and certain vegetables and fungi that are, usually in a more culinary fashion, prepared to generally mimic the experience of meat, but not exactly. We have plant-based meat products, which is what we predominantly focus on. So there's sort of legacy or pioneer brands, if you like Tofurky and Vegetalites, that came out in the 80s and 90s and weren't necessarily intended for meat eater audience. It was very much that niche vegetarian, vegan demographic, and therefore weren't intended to replicate the exact experience of eating meat. And then we've seen the newer generation of plant-based meat products really come to the fore in the last sort of 5-6 years. The early iterations came out, in the US, Beyond Meat, for example, about almost 10 years ago. And those products were targeted and still are targeted towards a meat reducer and flexitarian demographic. So trying to appeal to those who want the sensory experience of a conventional burger or sausage or mince, but are increasingly aware of the impacts of those choices and so want an easy swap. And that is really the theory of change around plant-based meat. Sure, we can tell people to eat more beans and nuts and tofu, and that's great, but the data shows that hasn't traditionally been effective in driving widespread behaviour change. Food is an emotional decision, not a logical one, for 99.9% of people. Us in the room probably are somewhat of an exception in that we're willing to perhaps go out of our way or make a financial sacrifice or a taste sacrifice when it comes to choosing something that aligns with our ethics and our values. For most people, taste, price and convenience is what they care most about, and that informs their food choices. And so the idea with plant-based meat is how can we appeal to the taste, the function and the familiarity culturally that people are used to, but in a form that has a far smaller impact. We've seen a lot of growth in the plant-based meat category in recent years. When Food Frontier started, there were fewer than 5 brands in the Australian and New Zealand market. There are now about 31 in major retail. About 2/3 now of those products, which are over 350 across all sort of retailers across the country, are now Australian and New Zealand made, whereas the majority used to be imported. So we've seen a shift there, although there's still a lot to be done to build out that full supply chain so that the actual ingredients are coming from Australia. This is from earlier in the year, so it's always changing. This is probably somewhat outdated, but this is the most recent slide that I could find in our deck in terms of the brands you might see, the Australian brands you might see on shelf. And they range from small startups through to, Simplot, Birdseye, Nestle. New Zealand also has a number of brands in this space, and then there's, of course, imported products as well. You might have seen in food service the increased options on menus, quick service restaurants like Grilled, Ferguson Clare, Hunky Dory, etc., and then even fast food, so Hungry Jack's Rebel Whopper, produced by B2 Food, came out a number of years ago. We, as part of our work, talk a lot about economic development and jobs growth bottom line, because we're trying to influence businesses and policymakers, and that's the language they talk, that's what they care most about. Environment is great, public health, yes, but they're very much secondary drivers. And so starting in 2019, we worked with Deloitte to project the potential size of the plant-based meat industry in Australia and put figures around what that would mean in terms of economic value add and jobs creation. 3 billion, or just under 3 billion was sort of the moderate growth scenario that they set out that we often speak to. Organisations like CSIRO have since done subsequent work that has fed off that, and they look at sort of the broader plant-based product and plant protein category, and they've estimated it could be worth 6 billion by 2030. This is in an ideal scenario, and there's a lot needed to get it there. We're talking about scaling new industries, including in some areas, sort of from the ground up. There are parts of this supply chain that are very underdeveloped. Happy to circle back on this, but I want to quickly do this through cellular agriculture. So cultivated meat, the idea being producing real animal meat, but by feeding cells nutrients directly, rather than growing those cells on the skeletal system of an animal. This is a concept that came up over 10 years ago, and we've since seen a whole number of startups attempt to do this. Fermentation, again, we sort of have those traditional forms of fermentation that you might be familiar with. Tempeh is an example in the plant protein space. Biomass fermentation, you might be familiar with products like Quorn. Technically, they use a process of biomass fermentation, but there are other companies like 8th Day Foods that are starting to do this in new ways with proteins like lupin. And then precision fermentation is being used by a growing number of companies to try to produce proteins, fats, and other inputs. It's already a technology used by the pharmaceutical industry. It's used in food to a limited degree, so ingredients like rennet in hard cheeses used to come from the stomachs of unborn calves, and or insulin from pigs is now produced through fermentation. There are challenges though in doing it for food because the scale is different and there are some different factors to consider. So these are the companies in Australia and New Zealand that are currently focused in this space. The cultivated meat folks, whether they're championing the entire process or just one component, and then precision fermentation on the other side. So what's required to grow markets for alternative proteins? What's not required is sort of the more relevant question. It's everything from building a stronger talent pipeline, seeing further private investment, later stage financing. Government plays a role. There's infrastructure gaps, regulatory, consumer education, getting all proteins in sort of parallel or tangential agendas like climate, and then really there's R&D that's needed to improve across the board from taste to functionality to nutrition, and that spans the entire supply chain from crop science and farming all the way through to sort of manufacturing and the consumer. So I'll just quickly touch on some of these. Investment in this space was quite strong for a number of years and probably peaked around 2021. Since then, due to a whole number of factors, partly just macroeconomic forces, there's a lot of venture investment that has gone downward in all sorts of industries. But also there was a period of hype around alternative proteins where a lot of folks got involved because it was exciting, there was a lot of buzz around it. And as investors and founders and media has come to realise that certain promises weren't fulfilled or certain timelines are going to need to be extended, there's been a level of skepticism starting to build around alternative proteins. And you see this all the time with new and emerging technology, so it's not to be, it's to be expected really. But that has seen a significant drop-off in investment. So the industry is going through this period of correction at the moment where there'll be companies that don't succeed, there'll be more acquisitions, there'll be fewer companies starting up presumably, but those that do get through that sort of chasm will require later stage financing to be able to scale. So how do you, in an industry that's still perceived as very early stage and high risk, get banking sort of institutions on board with the infrastructure development required for things like precision fermentation? So there's all sorts of conversations around what role does government play in de-risking that? What role does government play in directly funding it? Because just like electric vehicles and renewable energy, alternative proteins really should be on the agenda of policymakers in terms of being able to meet some of those key objectives. Policy and regulation plays a key role. Obviously, there needs to be a regulatory path to market. So we do work with the regulator for ZANS and other state-based agencies to try to get clear on that, because companies need to know that they can safely and in a timely way bring their products to consumers if investors are going to continue to back them. Consumer education, marketing and narrative building is a key one, and I think coming back to that point that food is an emotional choice means that it's not simply enough to put products in front of people and get them as price competitive as possible and tasty. People, it's a product people are putting it in their bodies. That means their perception of it is going to determine whether they're willing to try something new, and if it's seen as a science experiment, they're probably not going to want to eat it. And so there's a lot to be done there around warming people up to the idea of science being more involved in making their food. Climate's an obvious one, and then R&D, as I said, we're talking about everything from crop optimization to the scale up of fermentation for food production, extrusion for plant-based meat. There's still opportunity for significant advancement across the board. So how can you get involved? Obviously, your career as such a high impact way to contribute to anything meaningful is a big avenue. So opportunities range from sort of the sciences and engineering through to business development, marketing, and sales. As I've spoken about, there's about 40 to 50 companies in Australia and New Zealand now. Obviously, a lot of these companies are still on the smaller side, but as the space grows, hopefully there will be more job opportunities. And if you're not on our newsletter, we have a section about job postings. You can donate to organisations like ours. At this point, we're the only tax-deductible charity in Australia focused purely on alternative proteins. Sometimes we bring on board interns and volunteers, so if that's something you're interested in, please get in touch. We rely on that sort of support for some of our research, data collection and development, and then advocacy. So whether it's at your university workplace or to food outlets that you regularly go to, obviously advocating for more plant-based options is another way to get that pressure from the ground up. We have a major conference in a week and a half. This is sort of the key event for alternative proteins in our region of the world. We have shared a 50% discount for anyone that would like to still come along. That was posted on the Facebook group, right, so people can go there or get in touch. We obviously need to sort of cover our costs, but if that finance is still a barrier, get in touch. We might have a few complimentary spaces left. It just depends on how we're tracking. And I want to use the last few minutes for some Q&A. So is there a system for that, or are we just going to kind of go around?
There is a system, but the internet doesn't seem to be working down here.
Okay, let's just do it old school.
Thanks, Thomas. That was really fascinating. We might do it the old-fashioned way with a hands up. Louise, I think your hand was up first.
Hi, Thomas. Question. So if 3 to 6 billion is the potential size of the market by 2030, what's the size now?
Really good question. So our next State of the Industry report we're doing with Deloitte at the moment, and it'll come out hopefully around February. So we're actually crunching those numbers at the moment. In FY20, it was the plant-based meat industry in sales was 185 million. So a long way to go to hit that 3 billion target in a matter of years. It would see category growth that is pretty unheard of to get to that point at this stage. Not entirely unheard of, but it would require a lot of concerted effort to get it there, and that's why we're having conversations with retailers like Woolworths, government about how do we supercharge this growth knowing that this is needed. It's that push and pull, right? It's like on one hand the traditional food model is if the market's demanding it, we'll create it, but in this case, if Woolworths has ambitious 2025 sustainability targets, there's a question for them around the footprint of categories in their store, and do they have interest beyond just bottom line in expanding plant-based options? I think we had one on the edge. Yeah.
I'm wondering how you're convincing people to view this as less of a science project.
As in from the consumer standpoint? Yeah, it's a really important area that needs a lot more focus, and I think a lot more thought invested in it, because there's lessons from spaces like genetic modification where entire continents have outright banned certain technologies involved in producing food, which from an evidence standpoint don't necessarily, the arguments don't necessarily stack up. It was more of an emotional and industry to some degree sort of backlash. So look, I think transparency, communication, simplified and consistent messaging is really important. We're having these conversations with the startups that are already forming this very nascent industry. How they're talking about it now matters, and how journalists are reporting on it now matters, because it's already influencing. People are already forming their opinions of it, even though it might not be available for them yet. There's a number of years before those products will be on their plate or on a menu. And so, we're holding sort of industry forums and producing messaging guides and things like that, because it's that balance of you want to get it right, you don't want to mislead, but then you have to simplify it to a huge degree in order to cut through with consumers and speak about it in terms that are accessible.
Thanks so much, Thomas. We might have to wrap it up there.
Okay, no worries. I'm going to be hanging around for about half an hour, so if you want to come chat, that'd be great.
That'd be good. Thanks, Thomas.